The first lecture was given by Max Braubach, B-R-A-U-B-A-C-H, not a music historian, a historian from Bonn, 71 years old, a very lively, spry gentleman with whom I had the pleasure of talking privately, who has lived in Vienna for many years. His 7-volume biography of Prince Eugene of Savoy is regarded as a classic, and for it he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Vienna. In his lecture, Mr. Braubach described the cultural life of Bonn at the time of Beethoven's youth, the influence of the Illuminati, the Aufklärer, the rationalists, the French Revolution, on the thinking of the intellectuals of the town, which resulted in the establishment of a Masonic lodge, a newspaper, various cultural associations, reading clubs, the banning of the Jesuits, and the founding of an academy, which in 1786 was enlarged and made into a university. He commented on the reform spirit of the Archbishop-Elector, Maximilian Franz, who was the younger, more cautious brother of Joseph II, the Reform Emperor of Austria, both children of Maria Theresa, as was Marie Antoinette. Mr. Braubach also described the musical life of Bonn, which earlier in the 18th century was strongly under Italian influence, but later was taken over more and more by Germans. He mentioned, of course, among others, Christian Gottlob Neefe, the teacher of Beethoven, the concertmaster of the Hofkapelle, the two Reichers, Anton and Joseph, and Franz and Ferdinand Ries, Franz being the conductor of the orchestra of the Elector, and then of the opera, where Don Giovanni, Magic Flute, and Figaro were all performed. Dr. Braubach mentioned that even during Beethoven's Bonn period, there was already the plan to compose Schiller's Ode to Joy. A man by the name of Bartholomäus Ludwig Fischernich, F-I-C-H-E-N-I-C-H, wrote a letter to Schiller in which he mentioned Beethoven's project. So the idea of composing Schiller's Ode to Joy is not only foreshadowed in the choral fantasia, which we are going to hear in a few days, but goes back as far as Beethoven's Bonn period. I didn't know that at the time, but I see that Dr. Nettles' Beethoven Encyclopedia has that information also. Further, Mr. Braubach spoke of the 2 albums, or Stammbücher, which have been preserved from that time. The first one is well known, but he went into great detail about a second, more voluminous one, with fine drawings and about 40 signatures. The dedicatee of the first one, Babette Koch, a friend of Eleonore von Breuning, may have been Beethoven's first love, he said, because he wrote her 2 letters from Vienna before he even wrote one greeting to Eleonore von Breuning. This is in contrast to what I read in other biographies. Then Professor Braubach described the contents of the newly discovered album, which is not yet published, but will be published, he said, and sketched in the background of all the people who had entered their names into it with verses and quotations. He described their later careers and stressed that Beethoven, though he never returned to Bonn, maintained close bonds of friendship with at least some of them. He also quoted the general tenor of idealism and youthful effusion in this album and stressed that Beethoven in his later life never abandoned the ideas which were nurtured in this circle at the dawn of the French Revolution, and he stressed the general optimism and joy of life of that period. Now, much of what he said is probably very well known to Beethoven scholars, but it was delivered in a very lively and fascinating manner, and much of it was completely new for me. And this second diary, which is seemingly more significant than the first one, is a new find. Another very interesting lecture was given by Dr. Joseph Schmidt-Görg, double name Schmidt-Görg of Bonn, The Present State of Beethoven Research. Mr. Schmidt-Görg is an elderly gentleman and is either still active or just retired as director of the Bonn Beethoven Archive. The archive was founded in 1927, and I will later mention what Mr. Schmidt-Görg said of the purposes of the Bonn Archive and its activities. By the way, it was nice that in a rather title-conscious city like Vienna, where if you have glasses, you are a doctor, and if you tip amply, you're a baron, and if you say keep the change, you're a count, even to this day. And where they still award the title of court counselor, that in this title-ridden city of Vienna, all the speakers were simply introduced as Mr., without any pedigree, academic titles, or other distinctions. This made for a very nice democratic spirit of the whole presentation. Mr. Schmidt-Görg gave a history of the research that dealt with Beethoven since the first major biography of Beethoven by Anton Schindler, 1840, preceded by the notices by Wegeler and Ries. As we all know, Schindler is not reliable because he did not use any written sources, but if I understood correctly, he even suppressed a great portion of the Beethoven conversation books because they probably did not always fit into his picture of the hero. Mr. Schmidt-Görg stressed that the Beethoven biography of Alexander Wheelock Thayer is still the undisputed classic of the Beethoven literature. I have a special interest in Thayer because, as you may know, he was appointed by President Lincoln to the embassy, the United States Embassy in Vienna, and then functioned as the United States consul in my hometown, Trieste. He had wanted this appointment in Europe to be able to contact personally all the people who had still had any intimate knowledge of Beethoven. And through his long stay in Trieste, he was much better able to do that than if he had stayed in his native New England. Don't want to go into a review of Thayer's achievements. Let me just mention that in addition to his great Beethoven work, he also wrote a history and study of the possibilities of Trieste as a European port, possibilities which unfortunately did not materialize. He also immersed himself in biblical studies and wrote a book on the Egyptians in biblical times. At that time, they still knew their Bible. However that be, it was pleasant to hear that Thayer and Anglo-Saxon research in general, research on Beethoven, was praised very highly by Mr. Schmidt-Görg. He stated, for instance, that the new edition of Beethoven's letters by Emily Anderson contains about 200 letters more than any of the German editions, though Germany is now actively engaged in bringing out an up-to-date publication of Beethoven's correspondence. I will not go into detail and mention all the biographies which Mr. Schmidt-Görg enumerated. Rather, let me mention some of the sources for these biographies that are now stored in the Beethoven Archive. The Beethoven Archive has, among other things, acquired the complete collection of iconographic material, places, pictures of Beethoven, pictures of places where Beethoven lived, etc., by the Viennese scholar Theodor von Frimmel, about 30,000 items. They are now in Bonn. Stephen Leigh's collection of 7 volumes with 1,200 items, also iconography, is now in Bonn. The most complete collection of Beethoven's letters by Max Unger is also in Bonn. The Brunswick estate from Budapest is now acquired by the Beethoven Archive. Mr. Schmidt-Görg touched, of course, on the question of the immortal beloved of Beethoven and criticized very severely the book by Katznelson, which he qualified as scientifically worthless. He did say it reads like a detective story, but that's about all. You may know that not long ago, 13, as a matter of fact, 14 letters, a 14th letter has come to light. 14 letters of Beethoven have come to light which do away with Katznelson's theories for good. They rule out Josephine von Brunswick as the immortal beloved. It was interesting for me that an old friend of Mrs. Roberts' family, an antiquarian and dealer in old books and graphics, was instrumental in arranging for these 14 letters to be sold in Switzerland. He is not only a friend of the family, but the hotel in which Dean Bain and we stayed was next door to his office, and we were frequent guests in his house. Mr. Schmidt-Görg also enlarged upon the changing aspects of Beethoven research. He mentioned, for instance, that Ludwig Nohl, one of the best known of the German biographers of Beethoven, regarded Beethoven as the supreme expression of the Teutonic spirit. After the events of the first half of this century, a rather unpopular point of view. He also very graphically described how Beethoven research and the ideologies of Beethoven researchers changed. They range all the way from the viewpoint that Beethoven's music is not less than a mirror of the universe to Beethoven as a socialist and predecessor of the workers' paradise. Mr. Schmidt-Görg described the aims of the Bonn archive as more modest than the attempts of these Beethoven ideologists. There are 7,500 pages of sketches by Beethoven. Gustav Nottebohm deciphered only those that are relatively legible. So far, only 5 sketchbooks, if I understood correctly, have been published. The Bonn archive has transcribed 20. 4 are already available in facsimile. 4 are in preparation. The gradual and eventual preparation of all sketchbooks is one of the projects of the archive. I spoke already about the project of publishing a more complete edition of Beethoven's letters. Mr. Schmidt-Görg, of course, mentioned the difficulty of deciphering Beethoven's handwriting and stressed the fact that many of the most serious and best-equipped researchers have made mistakes. They thought they were dealing with originals when actually they had only facsimiles in their collections. For instance, Oskar Sonek, who collected Beethoven's letters in America, has that famous letter addressed to Abbe Stadler, expressing Beethoven's veneration for Mozart and a violent criticism of Gottfried Weber. Sonek thought this was an original. Actually, Sonek worked on a facsimile. The watermark of the paper is not of the period of Beethoven. The Bonn archive wants to concentrate all the available material for research on Beethoven in one place. It will edit a new complete edition of Beethoven's works under the editorship of Paul Mies, M-I-E-S, and has begun publication of a yearbook. This is the 3rd time a yearbook, a Beethoven yearbook, has been begun. It holds a library of 3,000 books, 30,000 photographs, and 110,000 Xerox copies, and is therefore the unrivaled scientific center for serious study of the composer's life and work. I've already mentioned the Herculean task of deciphering and transcribing Beethoven's sketchbooks and Konversationshefte. The most important collection of letters that has been added to the Beethoven archive in 1952 is a collection of about 400 letters. Many are items of the highest interest collected by a man by the name of Dr. H.C. Bodmer, B-O-D-M-E-R, in Switzerland. This collection was first offered to the city of Zurich, but the city fathers of Zurich refused the purchase because of its high price and because Bodmer made the condition that the collection remain a unit, not to be dispersed among other museum items. Upon this refusal, the collection was offered to the Beethoven archive, and it is now a treasured part of that institution. In deference to the wishes of the late collector, it is housed separately. I cannot report on some of the lectures because I did not attend, and I'm not a newspaper critic. There were classes in the conservatory in which I was interested, and I also listened to some piano exams there. Therefore, I cannot talk about some of the things that must have been very fascinating. But I do want to mention Kurt von Fischer, who gave a lecture here a few weeks ago and who also spoke about this contrast of classic and romantic, made some very valid points, I believe, particularly in the field of rhythm, and talked sense about what is classic in Beethoven, what is romantic in Schubert. Then there was a beautiful rhetorical firework by Luigi Magnani of Rome, who has worked on the Konversationsbücher of Beethoven. Then a masterly confrontation of Hegel, Hoelderlin, and Beethoven by Emil Staiger, S-T-A-I-G-E-R, perhaps the leading literary critic in the German orbit, from Zurich, a lecture that was classic in its content and form in its own right. And then there were for me at least, very controversial views of Hugo Goldschmidt from East Berlin on strophe and verse in Beethoven as principles of structure rather than the traditional idea of sonata development and fragmentation, etc., etc. And a paper by Bence Szabolcsi of Budapest, who did not appear personally due to a grave illness. A student read his short paper, and the Congress sent him a wire wishing him speedy recovery. Nor is there time for an account of all the exhibits and performances in Vienna, which I should have attended but didn't. The last lecture that I want to sum up in a few words at least was on Beethoven and the concept of classicism by Professor Heinrich Eggebrecht. Eggebrecht tried to get away from the loose journalistic parlor game of was Beethoven a classical composer or was he a romantic? Instead, he gave a historic and philosophic definition of the concept of classic. He analyzed the various and shifting meanings for which this word has been used through history. Classic originally means first class. Aulus Gellius, a late Roman compiler from about 130 to 180 AD, used the word in this sense. And the Roman grammarian Servius, Servius, in the 4th century, speaks of a classicus auctor. Later on, classic, according to Eggebrecht, takes on the meaning of complete in itself, placed in the past, authoritative, great, but at the same time still with us, immediately experienced. And I stress this. This double significance of the word, on the one hand, complete within itself, and at the same time still with us and uninterruptedly active, prevents us from thinking of Bach as a classic, because the 19th century he did not immediately and uninterruptedly experience him. The idea of classic as exemplary, as a model, is a romantic notion. It is due to the insecurity of romanticism, of the feeling of being late-born epigones. Before that, according to Eggebrecht, classic did not have the notion of being a model. Still later, and possibly not before the middle of the century, arises the idea of classic music as applying only to the Vienna Three, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Carl Maria von Weber would fully qualify to be a classic if we meant only a period of time, but from about the middle of the 19th century on, classic refers only to the Vienna Three. Mr. Eggebrecht quoted a writer by the name of Amadeus Bendt, if I understood correctly, who published a book in 1836 in Göttingen, where for the first time classic is defined as unrepeatable, a climax occurring only once, excellent, and of timeless presence. We understand under classic mostly an identity of form and content, whatever that means. The content of classic music, as we speak of it, is the specifically human, individual message of that music. The form seems to be, to us, unique and perfect. The particular aspect of the Vienna classic composer seems to be the transcendence of the individual to the generally humanly valid. Individual aspirations and strivings are at one with the universal. In this sense, Beethoven seems to us to be the highest expression of the individual. The contrasting and opposition of classic and romantic is, according to Eggebrecht, a modern fad. Neither Hegel nor E.T.A. Hoffmann recognized such a division. For Hoffmann and Hegel, all music is basically romantic because it lacks logical concepts. Eggebrecht's analysis of the loose usage of the word classic and the attempt to re-establish its true historic meaning seem to me a very valid and interesting contribution to aesthetics in relation to Beethoven.